Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to part 4 of the Getting Back on the Bus virtual conference series, Resiliency, COVID, and Lessons Learned. I'm Lisa Guthrie, Executive Director of the Virginia Transit Association, and I want to also introduce Danny Plogger, our VTA Deputy Director, who was our Zoom master this afternoon. We have shifted our conference session presentations to this virtual Zoom format because of the coronavirus meeting restrictions. We thank you for your willingness to participate virtually, and we hope to make the most of our Zoom session with you today. We're recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website following the event. We will save all the questions for the end of the presentation. Please submit your questions via the chat box, and we will ask them during the Q&A portion of the webinar at the end. We ask that you remain muted during the presentation. As a bonus, remember to stay until the end of the presentation for a special link to our virtual trivia quiz to win a $100 gift card courtesy of our virtual conference and mini expo sponsors. And the sponsor of today's webinar is HNTB. And it's because of generous supporters like them that we're able to offer our conference sessions and expo. Now I'd like to introduce our session moderator. Theresa Impastato is the moderator of today's webinar. She is the Executive Vice President and Chief Safety Officer at WMATA and has led their safety department since August 2019. Theresa oversees the Department of Safety and Environmental Management and is responsible for the management of system safety, occupational hazard management process, accident and incident investigation, fire and life safety, and the agency's management process. Theresa brings 20 years of experience as a veteran of rail safety and operations. Most recently, she was the Deputy Chief Safety Officer for Amtrak. Welcome, Theresa. You've got some great panelists here today.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm excited to be a part of this webinar. I want to briefly provide some context to our discussion and then introduce our distinguished panelists today. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a severe and ongoing impact on the transit industry. Even though we are still facing the day-to-day challenge of keeping riders and transit employees safe while providing essential service, our industry has already pivoted to thinking about how transit ridership can rebound as we demonstrate safety on our buses and trains. Instilling confidence in the riding public transportation is critical to not only our transit revenues, but it's essential to rebuilding our economy. Our three panelists bring unique points of view on this topic, and their insight will be especially valuable to our transit colleagues. Now, to introduce our panelists, first, we have Polly Hanson. Polly is the Senior Director of Security, Risk, and Emergency Management at the American Public Transportation Association. To strengthen and improve public transportation, Ms. Hanson coordinates with stakeholders to develop transit security, risk, and emergency management standards and policies. Ms. Hanson performs peer reviews and assists with safety audits and serves as an advocate for transportation security. Polly began her career as Chief of the Metro Transit Police at WMATA, and then went on to law enforcement and security positions at the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Department of Interior, and the Chief of Police at Amtrak. Next, we have Phil Washington, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. As CEO of Metro, he leads an agency that runs the United States' third busiest transit system, with 2,200 clean air buses, 6 rail lines covering 98 miles, and 4 additional rail projects in construction. Prior to his current position, Phil was the CEO of the Regional Transportation District in Denver and had a distinguished career in the military, retiring as a disabled veteran with 24 years of service in the United States Army. And last but not least, Terry Garcia Cruz is the FTA Region 3 Regional Administrator. Terry joined the FTA in 2015. She and her team oversee the federal funding for Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. Ms. Garcia Cruz guides 28 professionals in 2 offices, Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., who provide grant development and program management support to community partners. With executive leadership experience, Ms. Garcia Cruz served as Chief Executive Officer for several transportation agencies. She managed Metro in Cincinnati, including a 356 bus fleet and a workforce of 828. She also led transit systems in Austin, Texas, Lexington, Kentucky, Poughkeepsie, New York, and Tucson, Arizona. All of our panelists have previously participated in VTA conferences or webinars before, so we're very fortunate to have them back with us today.
Theresa, this is Lisa. Could I pause you before we continue to show the HNTB slide, please?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's see this spot from our sponsor.
Each morning, we wake up eager to build a brighter future for the places where we live and work. That's why we are here. We are here to benefit places that for us are more than just mere dots on a map. They're the very communities that we ourselves call home. We're not just building your community, we're deeply investing in our communities. HNTB has been here for more than a century and will continue leaving permanent impacts across the country. We are here doing much more than solving transportation challenges. We are here to bring people together and expand opportunity by engaging in the things that matter the most. We are here to make all lives better. We are here for everyone. And we're living our daily commitment by working with you to invest in a collective bright future, cultivating the next brilliant generation by introducing the possibilities of engineering to kids who otherwise might not have had the opportunity, not driving to work because we're proud to ride the local public transit system we helped create, and reading to kids to help them improve the skills they'll need to be successful. Over the generations, we have become the industry leader at bringing people together through innovation, collaboration, and inclusion to improve the quality of life for our friends, for our neighbors, and our families. We are here to create the community that's important to you. To all of us, we have been a part of your community in the past. We are here now, and we will continue to be here with you as we work together to build our community, our home. Each morning,
Thank you. Welcome, panelists. Polly, take it away.
Thanks, Theresa. It's good to see you again. And Lisa, thanks for the invitation to come back. Next slide, please. So this is me. It's interesting where a lot of people during COVID have grown all sorts of facial hair, and I got rid of mine. I want to draw your attention to, in addition to being with APTA, I'm also the vice chair of TSA Surface Transportation Security Advisory Committee, which is a group that reports directly to the TSA administrator. Some of my reflections will come from members of that committee as well. Next slide, please. So this is just a definition, but I think it's really important to set the table for what we're going to talk about, which is the ability of transportation systems to move people in the face of obstacles. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the resiliency of our employees who have been dealing with stressors in the workplace. Next slide, please. And those stressors have been not just COVID, but floods, hurricanes, fires, and then certainly many of our cities have experienced demonstrations and civil unrest. Next slide, please. So what worked well? Well, there were many pandemic plans already in place. They might not have been the best. They may not have been the ones that focused on this, but many agencies did have plans. And I'd say that the relationships that transit has with state and local emergency operations center, from some of the events that we saw on the previous slide, weather, special events, creates really strong relationships. The ability of the CDC to work with stakeholders, APTA early on was able to get CDC to issue guidance about paratransit, because we know that our paratransit operators get so close to our customers, and we wanted to make sure that they were provided with the appropriate guidance. And then the coordination with the federal government, with both myself and Theresa's chief, Ron Pavlik, represent the mass transit and passenger rail sector, and we worked very closely with CISA to create the language on essential workers and designated mass transit as being critical infrastructure. Next slide. We also know that many boards had to pivot, and CEOs, so that they could get permission for contracts for goods and services and to host board meetings virtually. And some CEOs have indicated that they actually prefer having a Zoom board meeting because it's allowed more participation from customers and stakeholders. And then, of course, for those folks who were not essential and were not operational and driving buses or trains or doing maintenance, the ability for the administrative people to be able to pivot to telework was very, very well done. Next slide. Additionally, the industry was able to create opportunities for physical distancing. Many agencies went to boarding on the rear door and different strategies, providing more service than they regularly would have to avoid crowding. And then the regulatory relief. APTA certainly did advocate to FRA, TSA, and FTA for regulatory relief for things like PTAS and the Transit Security Training Rule. And APTA continues to provide weekly reports to FRA for the regulatory guidance and relief that many agencies need. Next slide. Additional calls and conversations that folks had. VTA had any number of webinars. I think Lisa said this was the fourth. APTA, beginning in March, before most people even went home, had an early webinar. And then, of course, there have been regular calls with the industry. FTA has had listening sessions. TSA, FEMA, and CISA are all organizations that have had a lot of calls with the community and stakeholders to exchange information and listen to concerns. Next slide. So what we know is that although plans were in place, and I think Theresa would admit this, the one that she had at WMATA was old and will have to be updated. And then the federal government response was not as proactive as stakeholders might have liked to have seen. Next slide, please. There was a need to develop telework policies. While some agencies allowed people to telework periodically, it was not to the extent, and there was a sense that some employees showed up to meetings like they were on vacay, wearing ball caps backwards and t-shirts. And essential workers, the training and the proper use of PPE, it's interesting where the TSA public health official has indicated that when they do contact tracing on TSA employees that test positive, what they see from camera footage, as many times employees that work together and know each other well remove their masks when they speak, and that some employees do not properly wear their masks. They use them as shin straps. So it is essential that as we continue through this, that we do make sure that employees know how to wear masks, as that's very important. Some agencies did do temperature screening, either at the suggestion of their public health officials or their governor, and many would have liked to have had direction and information on that earlier. And then once again, the PPE, the testing, vaccinations, APTA has advocated to the federal government that transit workers be prioritized, not to say they'd have to get a vaccine, but when they become available, we want to make sure that people are recognizing the critical infrastructure and the essential role of our workers. Next slide. And once again, the social distancing and the mask rules, while voluntary in many cases, not enforced. Certainly folks saw the early video at SEPTA where the Philadelphia police pulled somebody off a bus. And of course, there's a video from an event at a football game yesterday. But you do see agencies now, they're getting tougher on enforcing masks because other riders and customers want to see people wearing masks. And then there were some things that transit agencies would have liked to have done, but because they had to negotiate with their unions because there might have been a change in working conditions, they weren't able to do those as quickly. And then we did see inadequate, sometimes inconsistent direction and guidance from the federal government. Many would suggest that an airplane, you know, can you sit less than 6 feet away from someone, where people would suggest that our air is just as clean. And so we continue to advocate for less than 6 feet. Many jurisdictions, because their public health officials have instructed them, they're doing 3 feet. And our European colleagues who have hosted many calls as well, UIC, UITP, CUDA, indicate that they use a different standard than the 6 feet. Next slide, please. Once again, some of the lessons learned were about the use of PPE, what to get, how to have it, where to store it, who to give it to, and the teleworking, and the policies that were really needed prior to the crisis. And of course, you know, we all know that there was lack of worldwide specific information about COVID and training on how to deal with this. And then of course, as I mentioned before, there were changing policies, you know, CDC said don't use transit, and then that was changed. And so that's been confusing for people. And then once again, early on, people were looking for guidance from the government that didn't come as quickly as people would have liked. Next slide. So these are some of APTA's resources. Mr. Washington is going to talk in more detail, but early on, in fact, before most people went home in March, APTA did have a webinar, and we've developed a number of toolboxes and papers, worked very closely with the folks who are indicated up on the screen. And we had the white papers on restoration and recovery and cleaning and disinfecting. And did tell people's good stories, did share best practices, and did provide an opportunity for folks, and we got a lot of emails early on to get their questions answered. And APTA staffers have had regular webinars and committee meetings and allowed their committee members to exchange best practices and information. Next slide, please. So looking forward, obviously everybody's going to look at this experience and try to improve their plans. We hear that many of our European colleagues are starting to experience another surge, so we could be going into another phase. And of course, we don't know what the fall will hold. We don't know exactly when the vaccine will be available. So once again, making sure that we're ready for the next phase, building on the experiences that we had, making sure that our plans are updated, that people really do understand how to use their PPE, that we have PPE in reserve in the event that we'll be wearing masks for some time, to make sure that we have a strong supply chain for cleaning supplies. And then of course, as I referenced earlier, APTA really is trying to see if we can get some relief on the 6 feet recommendation about social distancing. Next slide. That's my phone number and email address, and I look forward to answering any questions that we may have later. And I'm really happy to turn the program over now to Mr. Phil Washington, who is the CEO of the Los Angeles County Metro, and he is the chair of APTA's Mobility Restoration and Recovery Task Force.
Well, thank you so much, Polly. I really enjoyed your presentation. And thanks for all the great work that you have been doing and everyone at APTA, what you do for the industry. We all appreciate it out here in the field. I am honored, as Polly just mentioned, to chair the National APTA Recovery Task Force. Today, I want to give a brief overview of the work of the task force, and I'll talk about the Transit Recovery Commitment Program that we've put in place as well. Next slide, please. So why did we set up an APTA task force on service recovery? Various reasons, several reasons. You see these on the slide. We thought it was important for us to, as an industry, to collect the best practices around the country. There's a number of transit agencies that have been doing some really, really good things. And so collecting these best practices and then really shaping a national message and a narrative we thought was a good way forward. And of course, leveraging these transit restorations as a strategy and looking at various communities and doing all of this through the lens of social equity was very, very important to the task force itself. Next slide, please. The task force was made up of 3 co-chairs, and again, I was honored to lead the task force, but we had 3 outstanding people that served as co-chairs. Joanna Pinkerton is the CEO in Columbus, Ohio. Paul Wiedefeld, the CEO at Washington Metro, and Kim Slaughter from HNTB, our sponsor for this event today, all served as great co-chairs. We also had, of course, the task force was made up of 35 members, and they were primarily from the APTA committees. APTA has 21 committees, so they were made up from of the committees, excuse me, and the business constituencies, and we had representation from our Canadian agencies as well. In addition, we had 7 subject matter experts in the areas that you see here. So this is what made up the task force, excuse me. And of course, everyone was experts and outstanding in their own right. Next slide, please. So the various areas in our focus, our first big area was building public confidence. We think that in order for people to come back to transit, we have to build public confidence in the transit systems, not just in my case, one in Los Angeles, but all over this country. And so to do that, we have to understand what people are thinking, what their attitudes are about returning to transit, and really look at, and this was an idea that we had early on in the task force, to come up with what we call a seal of commitment, a physical seal or an emblem that showed that transit agencies that signed up for this program were committed to the best practices, cleaning, disinfecting, all those things that we had published. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the idea of providing flexibility for the differences in activities and to be able to customize this seal of commitment, language, and effort was very, very important for us. Next slide, please. So we went about the business of looking to see how we could gauge public opinion about transit. So we did a national focus groups. We did an analysis of transit agency public research. We looked at local and national public opinion research. As Polly mentioned, looking around the world, we wanted to understand the global experiences that was occurring all over the world as transit systems came back online. And so we did that. We asked the public what was their opinion about transit. Next slide, please. We also asked them, hey, what do you want the public, what does the public want transit agencies to do in order to come back to the various transit systems and in our industry? And what they told us was cleaning and disinfecting, of course, make it safe to return to transit, following public health guidance, obviously, being able to communicate if a bus is crowded. And there are apps out there, one that we just launched in Los Angeles, an app to let riders know that if a bus is coming on that particular line, whether it's crowded or not. And so those things are in place right now. Also making sure that our drivers, our bus operators, train operators are actually healthy. That was something that was very, very important to the public and requiring fellow riders to abide by the rules. And that is primarily face coverings, that sort of thing. So this is what the public wanted agencies to actually do. And understanding that was very, very important for this task force to understand exactly what the public was looking for us to do. Next slide, please. So our thinking was to establish a national program, really declaring and saying that transit agencies are committed, which we are, to protecting our riders and customers. And so the format, in terms of summarizing the transit actions and expectation of riders, was the idea of a seal or emblem that can be displayed by agencies, and they can customize these things as well to show their participation in this national program. Next slide, please. And the messages that we wanted to reflect and convey was what you see on this slide. What we are doing at the respective transit agencies around the country. And you see on the right side of this table, you see the commitments, public guidelines protecting each other. You see the agencies, we follow CDC, we clean, we disinfect, and then also what the riders should be doing, using face coverings and clean hands. So these, along with the emblem, these tables can be posted and are being posted in transit systems and displayed in transit systems all over the country. Next slide, please. So in terms of addressing the differences between the agencies, we know that each agency has a unique relationship with its riders. The relationship that I have in Los Angeles is different from the relationship that Dorval Carter at Chicago Transit Authority has in Chicago. And there's different approaches, and there's different procedures, there's different enforcement kinds of rules for face coverings and all of that. So we wanted to really balance and not be too prescriptive, if you will, with regard to the diverse approaches around the industry. And so the ability to customize these programs were very, very important to us. Next slide, please. And so as transit agencies, we made 4 major commitments to our riders, and you see them here, that we would follow official guidance, and you see some of the examples here, that we would clean and disinfect, and you see some of the examples here, that we would provide information and resources to riders, and you see some of the things we're thinking about there, and that there would be we would ensure that there are healthy transit employees that are operating the system. And so that is our, what we proposed as our commitment to riders. Next slide, please. In return, we asked our riders for 4 commitments that you see here. They should also follow the official guidance. And stay informed. We put some examples there. They should wear face coverings and wash their hands, and you see some of the examples here. Maintaining social distance. Polly talked about social distancing. Where practicable. There's been a lot of discussion on physical distancing. I have spoken out with regard to USDOT. Having one standard. We cannot have one standard. I mean, we should have one standard across all modes. So in the place of the airlines, where many airlines are keeping the middle seat open, well, that's not 6 feet either. That's something like, 2.5, 3 feet. And so where the rides on transit are much shorter than rides on airlines, we think that the physical distancing, to the degree practicable, is the right way to go. And then we ask riders to commit to not riding if they feel sick. And so These are the commitments that we ask our riders to commit to. Next slide. And so the Transit Recovery Commitment Program, this is something that we launched. We asked agencies to abide by these broad commitments. Agencies can add to the various details. They can give different examples, but the emblem and seal can be applied to the sides of vehicles. We're doing it in Los Angeles right now, at bus stops, at rail stops, at facilities and stations. If and when agencies actually sign up, we provide them with a toolkit with all of these things in it that include frequently asked questions and press release templates, so they can be ready to customize and put these things out in public. Next slide, please. So the request to agencies and next steps, we have been asking them to review and comment on this program. The toolkit is being forwarded to interested agencies. Many agencies have already signed up. I think we're around 150 agencies that have signed up for this program. They are using the templates in the toolbox. As they sign up and as they post some of these commitments from both the agency and the expectation of commitments from the riders, we believe that the public will regain confidence in the transit industry and in their local transit agencies. So that concludes my presentation, and I look forward to answering questions, and I'll toss it over to my friend, Terry Garcia Cruz. Terry.
Thank you, Phil. Great information, and Polly, you shared great information as well. And on behalf of the U.S. Department of Transportation, Secretary Chow, as well as Deputy FTA Administrator Williams and Executive Director Matt Welvis, it's a true honor to be with all of you today. And I'd like you to just pause for just a moment. And I would like to express my condolences. I know the transit system has really experienced tremendous loss through COVID, whether it's through your workforce or through family members. And I know that within our industry, 8,000 individuals have been impacted, and we have confirmed positive cases. And it's a tragic situation, but I know we'll be resilient and we'll come out of this. So I just want to express heartfelt empathy. And so with that said, if you could then go to the next slide, and I'd like to kind of give you a flavor of just briefly what I plan to cover with all of you. And just talking a little bit about operationally, and I know you're living it, so this will not be new news for you. Some of the construction implications and how FTA responded, and some actions that are being taken by transit agencies, and some creative approaches. So next slide, please. And we know that when this particular pandemic surfaced, and we're now seeing that budgets are decimated, ridership is plummeting. We're seeing, like, nationally that there's a 60% decrease in ridership. And we know that also that there are several transit systems that are not even operating at this point in terms of service. And that's approximately 93 transit agencies. So that's a large number. And we also know that 377 transit agencies have some level of reduced service. And so that's an incredible impact. And when this first started, we really wanted to get a handle on what the capital projects were going to look like, and what the impact would be, as a lot of federal funding is allocated to those major construction projects. So to embark upon that, we actually hosted several listening sessions because it was important to hear from our transit partners to see exactly what the impact was. And what we heard basically was that from a construction company perspective, that they were acknowledging that there was a different way of doing business and having to protect their own workforce and trying to determine how to best do that with the social distancing, as well as just the whole number of individuals that were available to do the work, because they too were being impacted by COVID. And so we know that schedules are a little off, but we also know that schedules are being accelerated because of the reduced traffic congestion. Engineering firms have told us they're trying to learn how to do this business in a whole new realm. Just like all of us right now are probably in a telework status, the engineering firms as well are trying to keep a handle on all that. And business owners basically had lessened impacts because unfortunately they didn't have business that typically they have. So we also heard from some of these stakeholders that some of the subcomponents, the supply chain aspects were also being affected, as well as the trade particular occupations, for example, welders. You know, welders are always seeming to be difficult to find, but even in this particular situation, we saw that particular impact on in MTA on the Purple Line, as well as the Silver Line, the extension to Dulles. So, you know, we're seeing some of those aspects as well. And so, next slide, please. Everybody has, I'm sure, appreciate the funding that's coming your way, right? I would hope. And I know that there's a desire for additional funding. We're definitely hearing the message. And so back on March 13th, when there was an emergency declaration established, what FTA wanted to do was really be responsive. And that's where, through our Emergency Relief Authority, we were able to take our urban formula funds as far as, and also the rural funds, and allocate those to transit systems. In the larger systems, they typically did not have operating assistance. You couldn't use your dollars for operating assistance. And so at that point, we knew that there was a lot of effort in terms of just trying to keep your buses clean, your rail systems clean, protecting your workforce. And so with that said, we made those dollars available, and not at the typical 50%. We actually allocated the federal contribution to be 100%. So that was the first step that definitely we thought was appropriate. And then with the $25 billion that came out from the region, or through Congress, and then allocated to the various regions, and I want you to go to the next slide if you don't mind, please. So I can kind of show you the allocation for Virginia. And you can see that for Virginia, there was about almost $306 million. And we've obligated about $186 million so far for this one particular geographic area. So the top number there, the top column, shows kind of what, or the second to the top, the Region 3 allocation was about $2.9 billion. We've allocated about $2.6 billion, so we're almost at 90% now. These are numbers that were previously put together, but I looked this morning to make sure I had accurate information to give all of you and current information. And so in terms of FTA, I looked this morning as well, and we've allocated about, I would say, almost $23.3 billion. So that's a lot that's been allocated, and you know, in terms of the percentage that's out there, it's about 93%. So we were really trying to get those dollars out to the community, trying to help transit systems deal with the issues that they were handling within their transit systems. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we also wanted to be a really good federal partner. We knew that transit systems were struggling with just how to deal with the pandemic. And so we wanted to be the last obstacle in terms of more federal regulations that needed to be followed. So at that point in time, the triennials, the state management review system reviews, as well as the safety agency plan, all of those went into a holding pattern. And we decided that we were not going to burden transit systems with those regulatory guidelines and compliance. And so with that said, we also wanted to make sure that we were a resource to our partners and actually established not a hotline, but an email hotline, if you will, in which there were about 1,100 inquiries that came in regarding the CARES Act and how to handle that. And so we wanted to make sure that we were proactive in our technical assistance and that we actually continue to support our federal partners and administer that regulatory relief. We had a lot of frequently asked questions posted on our website, and safety advisories were actually in place as well. And with the initiative, the initiative whole of government, actually there were 15.5 million facial coverings sent out from the U.S. Department of Transportation and FEMA. And with that, we wanted to ensure that transit workers were protected as well as the riders. So that went out. We received a lot of thank yous from our agencies. And so that was a really good step. Next slide, please. And so learning from each other is probably the best approach, right? You can tell just by some of the practices that have been shared by the previous speakers. We're trying to embark upon that network and that sharing of information. And so those listening sessions, and Polly mentioned them earlier, here are some of the ones that were offered. And back yesterday was managing vehicles and facilities, and that was really informative. And so if you've missed some of those, I just want to let you know that they're on the website, and you can actually listen to those when it's convenient for yourself. And then we've also worked with the industry in getting a example of good industry practices, supplies, and that's on the APTA website. And next slide, please. I know that we keep hearing that transit agencies are being really creative, whether it's providing a bus to be a hotspot for kids who are doing the virtual learning, to providing groceries and delivery of food boxes. It's really great to see how our transit systems have become community partners and being very creative in some of the solutions. Here's an example of Maryland, who's, all the different barriers that you're seeing there, they've actually manufactured those within their own transit system, using their maintenance team to do that. Some recognition of the great efforts that have been done, and some of the internal cleaning of their air, some strategies there. Next slide, please. So, as a former CEO, I know that transit is resilient, and we're part of the solution, and we'll all work together to really bring America back to health and prosperity. Thank you for all you do, and it's been great spending some time with you today, and please be safe. And back to you, Theresa.
Thank you all for your insightful presentations. For those of you who have any questions, please feel free to note them in the chat box. I do have a couple questions that were sent over in advance. To Polly, what is one of the biggest or most important lessons learned by agencies during the response to the pandemic virus?
Well, it's interesting, and I'm not just sure it's the agencies. I think that our communities, our government leaders recognized once again how critical transportation is and how vital our employees are and how they're such a strong part of the communities that they serve. And Terry referenced some of that. You had folks in San Antonio taking their buses to communities when kids had to virtually learn for people who didn't have access to Wi-Fi. And many people knew that they had folks that needed the ability to get to the grocery store. So instead of taking everybody to the grocery store, they went and got the groceries and took them to those communities. So I think that we recognized and confirmed how important we are and how incredible our employees are. And so that reconfirmed that with ourselves. And then we were also able to get that recognition from our government leaders and the communities that we serve.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Transit systems truly make the essential possible. Phil, one of the programs at LA Metro that came out of the COVID-19 crisis is the Fareless System Initiative. Can you explain what that is and the ideas behind it?
Yeah, the Fareless System Initiative, you know, I won't say it came out of COVID. Now, it was accelerated because of COVID, but we were talking about a fareless system probably a year and a half ago. I was talking about this and it was tied to congestion pricing. And what we said then, a year and a half ago, was in order to address the congestion and sometimes gridlock in the LA County area, that we needed really a two-phased approach. And one was a traffic reduction program that included congestion pricing and using the revenues from congestion pricing to make transit free for everyone. And we were talking about that a year and a half ago. Now, COVID happened, of course, and we decided that, you know, while we're working towards our traffic reduction program that includes congestion pricing, that with the economic fallout of mostly essential workers that ride our system, where our bus riders have an average annual income of only $18,000 a year, and our rail riders have an average income of $28,000 a year, that we should accelerate this idea of a fareless transit system. And so I have created a task force to study all of the things associated with a fareless system. I've asked that task force to come back to me before the year is out with the hope that we can implement a fareless system as soon as next year.
Wow, that's really innovative and just a wonderful idea all around. Terry,
Absolutely.
what has been the biggest challenge in administering the CARES Act funding?
Well, Theresa, I think, you know, it's been really difficult, honestly, it's just the bandwidth and just the resources to get out almost $3 billion just, you know, from March to currently. And, you know, kudos to the regional team and the regions working across the United States and headquarters, because there's been a tremendous commitment in understanding how critical the dollars are. And, you know, whether it's to pay your operators, whether it's to purchase those additional barriers, whatever the case may be that systems are using the dollars for, we know how critical it is to get that funding into the community. And so I would say that managing that amount of funding coming in so expeditiously and trying to get it out quickly in concert with all the other federal funding that we know folks are waiting on. And so I know that there are a lot of regional staff and headquarters staff that have really worked nonstop. And, you know, there's a saying now, it seems like, you know, we're living at work, right? So I think in a lot of cases that might be a little bit of reality of what a lot of us are feeling right now. But you know, it's important to get the dollars out, and now hopefully they'll be expended quickly as well. But like I mentioned earlier, there's that increased sensitivity to know how critical these dollars are for transit systems and states that are using that to allocate those dollars to other transit systems or other municipalities. So that's what I would say in reference to that.
Absolutely. So we have a question in the chat box asking as a follow-up, are there still CARES Act funding available for transit systems in the Commonwealth of Virginia?
What's been allocated has been been allocated. I know there's some discussion in Congress about additional funding, but at this point, we know that that has not been allocated at this point. So I would really look to your the Virginia Department of Rail Public, and look at that and see if you can work with them as community partners and see if maybe there might be an allocation there. I know they're probably saying, Terry, why are you telling us that? But you know, sometimes there's a reallocation of dollars, and so I would definitely talk to them and see if there is any opportunity to maybe redistribute some dollars.
Great, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
We have another question for you. What was one of the biggest challenges faced by agencies?
I think that when I alluded to in the beginning, I think that agencies did an amazing job of pivoting. You saw agencies going to A and B teams, and some of the creativity that we heard on an earlier call that Lisa had about protecting bus operators. People took $5 shower curtains. So I think the ingenuity and the creativity of agencies to respond to this crisis, both to protect their employees and then to serve the public, was really, truly amazing.
Thank you, I agree. I really, truly was overcome by how the industry at large broke down barriers and collaborated very early on and openly shared and exchanged information, ideas that had merit. I think that it really showed that when faced with the worst, we rose and were truly at our best.
You know, Theresa, I think that is one of the great things about a call, you know, a webinar like this, and Lisa and her group, you know, coming together with other associations and having webinars like this and calls where people could exchange those best practices, because not everything costs a lot of money. And there were things that, as you indicated, people, depending on where you were, because of the way that this evolved, people were not all the same time at the same place. And Mr. Washington mentioned this, you know, what happens in Chicago is different than in DC and different in LA. And we saw this unfold across the country. Some places were further ahead of other jurisdictions. And so they had already come up with solutions for cleaning when you couldn't get access to cleaning supplies because of the supply chain. So I think that is one of the things, and having been in transit for over 30 years, that makes you so proud to be a part of a transit agency or this profession, because folks are always so willing. They're not competing against each other. They're really collaborating and supporting. And so I think that is one of the things. And, you know, bringing up your bus maintenance folks, you know, they didn't just have A and B, they had A, B, and C. And so you had your A and B teams, and then, you know, you had your, you know, bus maintenance gentlemen who had decided to have a C team sitting on the bench so that when people on A and B got sick, he had people that could, you know, come on the field, never miss a beat to keep those buses running. And so I think we just have really talented people who come up with ideas, you know, every day, but have really risen to the occasion. And of course, Terry references where we did have people die. You know, if the medical workers were you know, in the trenches, our people were taking them to the battlefield and dying doing that. And so recognizing that, and how people, many CEOs and managers said their absenteeism was less than on a regular day during COVID folks knowing that they really didn't know what they were facing, came to work like we do anytime. You know, Harvey with Houston Metro, those bus operators, many of them lost their homes in the hurricane, were living in shelters, and still came to work to provide transport to people who needed to get to hospitals, to work, or to get to vital medical care. So it just makes you really proud to be a part of transportation.
That it absolutely does. I am just endlessly impressed with the caliber of individuals that we have in the industry. So I don't see any more questions in the chat box. I think I learned a lot by participating in this panel. I thank you all very much for your time, dedication, and expertise. This is far from over, so there's definitely a lot more for us to learn. So with that, I thank you for your participation, and back to you, Lisa.
Okay, thank you. This has been wonderful. I want to thank everybody for participating, and I want to give a special thanks to our fantastic moderator and panelists, and of course, today's sponsor, HNTB.